This is tape number 2. Today is September 5, 1996. Survivor Sam Kreisberger. We're in Dix Hills, New York. Okay, we got as far as the early summer of 1940. The Russians are now occupying Chernovitz. Please continue the story.
Well, we had this neighbor that I mentioned to you was a colonel in the NKVD. And very soon after that, we obviously were put into new schools. We had to learn Russian. At the age of, at that time I was about 10 or 10, 11 years, no problem. I was able to speak Ukrainian from before because, as I told you, I spent all my summers with my grandparents' home. All the peasants were speaking Ukrainian. Most of the kids that I played soccer with and so forth were Ukrainian kids, and you lived there because the help was Ukrainian, the maids were everybody, so you learn languages quite easily. So I spoke Ukrainian. I had no difficulty learning the true Ukrainian because what the peasants were talking is a sort of a slang kind of Ukrainian. I also learned Russian. I was able to write and read Russian fluently. I can still understand. I can still read a little bit, but I wasn't exposed for it so many years, so I really didn't pursue that. So, which is a shame because it would have been nice to know another language and not to forget it once you know it. But I went to school. It was a very depressing kind of environment. For instance, one thing that I remember, there was a little girl in the class that was not even Jewish, but the suppression of religion was so intense, and she must have come from a Greek Orthodox, very religious family, that I remember her crying always when, for whatever reason, and for instance, on the high holidays, you had to go to school, because if you didn't go to school, they knew that you observed, you went to temple, you went to services, the parents, whatever, and but you really you did it, but you could not openly practice religion. It was a tremendous anti-religious move and it wasn't just anti-Jewish, it was an anti-religious kind of environment that the communism had, the atheistic, materialistic, whatever they call that policy. And so it became a very scared environment. You were basically your best friend. You would not discuss politics. Because you do not know what he would say to somebody that I said, and the next thing you can find yourself. And people were actually, for nothing, were arrested, and many of them judged very quickly. And what became a common word, it was Siberia. You were deported to Siberia. If you got 5 years in jail, that's where you went. And not many came back from these gulags and so forth. And then came out the order that everybody has to register and get a passport. Now, we had no idea what that meant, but everybody had to go and get a passport. And you had to go to the NKVD, to the secret police, to that building, and everybody had to line up and stand in line, and they interviewed you and whatever it is, and people didn't know what to say, what is the right thing to say, what's the wrong thing to say, and you just got a passport. Just when that was happening, my neighbor came over and said, "Don't go down. I will tell you when to go down. You are going to meet me there, and I will take care of the rest." we had contact with him, you know, and I knew the kids, my wife and his wife, but basically we had little, my father and him really had little in common. By the way, they nationalized everything. My father became a worker in his factory. I mean, they nationalized everything. Nobody owned anything. That didn't take long. That happened overnight too. And one day he told us, you meet us at the downtown, wherever the NKVD was, downtown, the headquarters, and he met us. And he not only asked for our names, but he asked for my uncles. He said, you get all your family. And even my grandparents who lived in the village, he said, you give me their names. We will take care of everything here. When we got down, we got passports. My relatives got passports. My grandparents got passports. And we didn't know, so we got passports, so what? And after that, my father was working. I went to school. People got arrested here and there. And life continued in a scared way. You just, you no longer had the maids, and you no longer had, you couldn't move, by the way. We could go to my grandparents, but you couldn't go probably much further. You know, in Russia, you cannot travel without travel permits. So life became much more stricter. It was, and then sometimes, I think in 1941, in the spring of 1941, and I really don't know the exact time frame, it was March, April, May of 1941, overnight, one night, like 2 nights in a row, they just closed up certain streets, the secret police, and the whole town, and they came to certain apartments in certain homes. They did. It was not a wholesale. They knew where to go. They knew exactly, and they gave the people like 1 hour to pack a suitcase. They put them on trucks downstairs, took them to the railroad station, and they were deported to Siberia. And that's where we found out. Well, we didn't find out yet. Let me regress. They didn't come to us because we had the right passport. It depends what your passport said. There were numbers. If you had, then we found out later that I think it was a 39 or a 29. If you had a 39, you were safe. If you had a 29, you were going to Siberia. I don't know, but
what was their rationale? What categories of people did they send to Siberia?
That's why I'm saying that's the reason I'm sitting here. If it wasn't for that man, because anybody who owned anything, any shopkeeper, any industrialist, anybody who was not a proletarian, so to speak in quotes, a worker from the workers' paradise, was deported. And 5,000 to 8,000 people were sent away.
And did you know, or did you learn in the first 30 or 60 days, I mean the adults, of course, maybe you heard it, whether they were being deported to work in factories or to go to a gulag or to be in a town, or
they
where
were
they
deported to go to a gulag. They were deported to Siberia. That is what they called the Arctic, or the cold, whatever they were calling it, the cold. And so they were deported to Siberia. Now, it is true, out of Siberia, maybe 10 or 20% came back. So maybe some of these people survived because they were deported. You can look at it from a positive, but anyway, an incident that happened though, we were in Chernovitz. There were no phones in those days. We did not know. We know the deportations took place. We did not know if my grandparents were deported or not, because they deported from the villages, from the whole Bukovina. They deported from the villages too. And let's face it, we knew we weren't deported. We assumed that my grandparents, he did the same thing for them, but we were not sure. And the way, the level of anxiety was so that my parents were afraid to go. You didn't like to go on the street because you were still afraid maybe that a truck will just stop and put you on that bar, on that truck, and you're gone. So I went. I was 10, 11 years old, and I went, I put on short shorts, and was in the spring, as I told you, it was in May, April, May, whatever, and I went to Slobozia Vanila, where my grandparents were living, to find out if they're there or they're gone. It took me about 24 hours. I went by foot. I hitchhiked on a bus. I hitchhiked on whatever. It took me a while to get there, but I found out they were fine. They were also fine, and they would have been gone because a lot of people, other people that were landowners in the village were gone. So this man, this colonel of the NKVD that my mother helped that first day, saved our whole history. Now, we might have survived Siberia, I don't know, but we definitely would have been a definite candidate to go there. So I am a definite believer in fate, or whatever you want to call it. And if I may digress for a minute, through the last whatever years since the Holocaust, since the war, there is one saying that has a great meaning to me: to be in the right place at the right time. Now, in this country, when you talk about that, you talk that you bought the right stock and you made money, you met the right girl, you whatever, things that are very important. But in those days, from my mind, whenever I think of that saying, it means life or death.
Okay,
and you can put it later, like left or right Mengele, where he pushes you. It is being in the right place at the right time and the right decision, or being in the wrong place at the wrong time. So that saying is so profound in my mind, right, that if that man didn't move into that, if there was no Romanian family living across that had to flee, if he didn't come in to move into that apartment, who knows?
So now it's the spring of 1941. What are you hearing about the war, and when did the Germans come to Chernovitz?
Well, we are at that point. Once the deportation took place, they continued. They had, I think, like 2 weeks later, you know, the rumors were flying, but we knew already that we have escaped. People had all kinds of passports. There were all kinds of things. Then people claimed that they were sick or whatever, and then they took the people that were sick, whatever it is. But we escaped that part of the Russian terror scene. So now we are in 1941, and I think that Hitler attacked Russia, you know, when he broke his agreement with his non-aggression pact, I think in end of June of 1941. So he attacked, I think it was the 22nd of June of when the war started with Russia, when Germany attacked Russia. And so the Russians were totally in disarray. They left the town. We went through no man's land. Nobody came in for about a week or 10 days or whatever. We had hooligans. We had people coming, robbing, doing all kinds of things. And we still didn't know what to expect. We were living in our apartment, and you stayed there, and you prayed for the best. About a week later, the Russians were gone, and I would say around beginning of July, the Russians were gone, and the first troops that came in were German troops. And that is for the first time we saw German soldiers. We didn't know what was happening. We were still in our homes. We did not go out. We were scared to go anyplace. But from our balcony, we could see some fires further on, and then we found out that the Germans took the chief rabbi of Chernovitz and burned down the great synagogue of Chernovitz, a magnificent building that has been standing there for many years, and a magnificent architecture, and they burned it down. They also shot the rabbi, the cantor, and a lot of their Jewish dignitaries, and they did their thing the way we later learned they do that. They sing, they tell you, please come and open it, and they first bring you a sense of security, and then once they got you, they burned the temple and they shot them outside of by the Prut, which was the river that went through Chernovitz, and they were shot there. That we found out later. What we didn't know, again, just as we didn't know my grandparents were deported by the Russians, we didn't know what was happening, what happened over there in the villages. We only found out a week later or 10 days later that my grandparents were killed. Not only they, but all the whatever 300 or 400 Jews that lived in that village and every village around it. So probably 20,000 Jews in that whole northern part about Chernovitz, in the smaller villages which contained 300, 400, 500 Jews. They were just killed, outright shot by the Ukrainian peasants. Not by Germans. There were no Germans. By the Ukrainian peasants. The Germans followed the Russians on the front. There were the Ukrainian peasant, we found out, killed them even before the Germans came in.
Who gave them the order?
There were no orders. There was that level of anti-Semitism.
Running?
Right. No, there are rumors that the SS or the Gestapo parachuted one guy into the villages, and he picked the people that were willing to do that. But I think that might be a myth. They were just they were able to vent their. They knew that they're not going to be punished by the Germans for killing the Jews and by the Romanian, so they finally vented the Ukrainian their most inner feelings, and they just killed and they came to our home. By the way, I forgot to tell my grandfather, besides being a landowner, he also had a flour mill. In those days, it wasn't a flour mill like here. You have a large flour mill. It was a river with a water mill wheel going, and the people brought their wheat, and they put it between two stones. And I even remember that. And there was a guy in charge that was the technician that did that. And the rumor had it that he is the one that killed my grandparents because he wanted to take the mill, and he even came a week later to our home as if he was terribly in shock for the death of my grandparents. And he told I'd like to regress here for a second. They lived in a nice home where the whole family could come during the summer, and it was a large home, but there was no running water. You had kerosene lamp. There was no electricity. So they had a well just outside, about, I would say, 20, 30 feet from their porch, and it was like stones, and it was, like I remember, a little hill going up. And from what he told us, He said that my grandfather was just going to the well to get water, and he said those other hooligans or whatever, those other bad peasants came and shot him right there. And when my grandmother heard that, she ran out of the house, ran to him, and they shot her right, and she fell right on top of him. And then they killed all the other Jews of the village, and we have no idea where they're buried. Allegedly, they took all the bodies close to the river Chermush, and they had like marshes in that area, and that everybody's buried there someplace in a common grave. But that happened in every village by the hundreds. I mean, they just massacred all the Jews in all those villages, what I call the smaller villages. Now, there were small towns which had 2,000 people, 3,000 people. Those they were not, because it was already a city environment. If you look at a village, you look like here. When you go to a farm, on a farm, there's a house here, there's a house there, and there they knew where the Jews are, and the peasants just came and they just killed all the Jewish homes, and that what happened. In the bigger cities, I don't know at which point in time, but they killed maybe some people, but they put the others in ghettos or whatever.
Who's the they now in the bigger cities? The Ukrainians?
No,
or the
no, no.
Germans?
The Germans were gone. They arrived, they burned the temple in the big city in Chernovitz, and they followed the Russians. And they were gone, and the Romanians took back what was theirs before the Russians, and the Romanian took over the administration of,
So what
of the whole
happened to
Bukovina.
you and your family and
We
the
were
rest
in-
of 41,
Okay,
42, 43?
we were in Chernovitz, and around, that was in, as I told you, that was in the July time frame. Obviously, the Romanians came back. All kinds of Romanians came back. They took everything that was, it was already nationalized, like my father's factories were already nationalized by the Russians. But Romanian came that had political pull someplace, and he took over the factory. And my father went to work for him because he didn't know how to run the factory. He didn't pay you anything, but
Right.
you were happy he didn't kill you either, so you were just... And then one day, and it was it's very easy to remember, it was on Simchas Torah of 1941, the most joyous day in the Jewish religion. An edict came out that by 5 o'clock all the Jews have to go to a ghetto. They had to go. It was like every town, like we have in New York, the Lower East Side or whatever, if you want to call that a ghetto once upon a time, not today. But this was where the poor Jews used to live. There was a Judengasse, a Jewish street where the Jews lived. And all the Jews from the whole town, now we've already lost about 8,000 that went to Siberia, so maybe we're left with 50,000 only. You know, I'm just saying. So all these had to cram into that, and we were, 50 people in an apartment where there should be 5, and you just crammed in. If you knew somebody there, you were lucky. If not, you were in the hallway, and you were in the ghetto, and they put barriers around you. You could not go out. You could only go and buy food, I think, like 2 hours a day or whatever, and you left your apartment with whatever you could carry. Wherever I lived, we left the apartment, closed the door, and left. And then they started to deport. They simply took like certain streets and just, if my memory holds correct, and just took the people and marched them to the railroad station, put them, and we did not even know where they were going to go, but we found out later that they were sent to Transnistria, which means the other side of the Dniester. That was still under Romanian. The Germans have given that part of which is now the Ukraine, they've given that also to the Romanians, so they were under their administration. So these were not death camps, these were labor camps, but they were such harsh conditions that the survival rate was 10%. I mean, that you found that out later. Now, what happened in the meantime, while they were starting to deport and while they put the Jews in the ghetto and locked them up, a strange thing happened to the town. It just stopped existing as a town economically. The Jews were the ones that were running the factories, that that were basically involved in a great part. And suddenly, the town economically stopped to exist. So the governor, the Romanian governor, said he has to do something, so he decided to pick what he considered essential Jews to take them out of the ghetto. The luck of, again, our luck was that the man that took over my father's factory didn't know anything about running a textile factory or a glass and mirror factory. So he needed my father. So he went and, you know, the Romanians had to ask what's essential. He went and he got my father permit to leave, and you've got a card with a Jewish star on it which says the Jew so-and-so has this permit number to reside in the town of Czarnowiec for, you know, and we were taken out of the ghetto and we went back to our apartment.
So the majority of the Jews were transported.
So we were,
you were allowed to exist.
And probably another 5,000 of the
under
50
under protection of the Romanian government,
right,
which was allied with the
with
Germans.
the German. That was our luck, because in Poland and in Hungary that was the enemy. So the Germans were there. We had no Germans. We didn't have the Gestapo. We had the Romanians. No, they were not. They deported them. So they deported probably 40,000 people or whatever. 5,000 or something went back to the town, and there were 3,000. That's a very important part of the story. Our document was signed by the governor of Romania. At the end, after they deported, there were about 3,000. The ghetto shrunk to the point there were only about 3,000 Jews left. There was a mayor of Czarnowiec that lived in a Romanian that lived there before the war. His name was Popovich, and he was what I would call a righteous Gentile, and what you call today the righteous Gentile. And he gave permits to those 2,000 or 3,000 Jews that were left, cards also, that you can leave the town and go back to your apartment. And everybody went back. We went to ours. It so happened ours wasn't even, it was still there. Nobody had gone in to break in, and we lived there. My father went to, so the only people in town were those 6,000, 7,000 Jews, I cannot give you a number, but somewhere around 5,000 Jews. My father went to work. He had a permit to go in the morning and come back at night. Anybody else could not leave, but from 10 to 12 in the morning, you had to wear a yellow star.
We're going to have to interrupt. We're out of room on the tape, so we'll finish the story, the two kinds of permits, and how you were able to survive in the town on the next tape.
Okay.